My name is Jake, and I'm what you might call a connoisseur of the absurd. I appreciate a good prank, a well-timed sarcastic remark, and the sweet, sweet taste of freedom, especially when that freedom involves grilling steaks in my own backyard without someone measuring the smoke plume for HOA compliance. That's Homeowners Association for the uninitiated, and in our little slice of suburban paradise, it was less an association and more a dictatorship ruled by a woman named Karen. Karen. Just the name sends shivers down the spines of even the bravest garden gnomes. She was the self-proclaimed queen of our neighborhood, a woman who could weaponize a perfectly manicured fingernail and turn a misplaced trash can into a federal offense. Her blonde hair was always coiffed to an impossible, helmet-like perfection, and her smile, oh, that smile. It was the kind of smile that said, "I'm about to make your life a living hell, and I'm going to enjoy every second of it." We'd had minor run-ins before, a disagreement about the precise shade of patriotic blue allowed for flagpoles, a heated debate about the acceptable chirping volume of crickets after 10 p.m., but those were mere skirmishes compared to the all-out war that was about to erupt. Our HOA, you see, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic tyranny. The rulebook was thicker than a phone book, remember those? Filled with regulations so ludicrous they'd make your head spin. Pet nail polish had to match the house trim. Lawn ornaments were subject to a rigorous height and whimsy assessment. And don't even think about letting a single blade of grass grow a millimeter out of line. It was a world of beige conformity, where individuality went to die a slow, painful death by 1,000 paper cuts, literally in the form of fines. Our street was home to many other neighbors, two, in particular, old Mr. Henderson, a retired engineer with a mischievous glint in his eye, and a surprising knowledge of medieval siege weaponry. He was a recluse, to say the least. Then there was Mrs. Gable, the neighborhood's resident information broker, who always be in the middle of the business street. It all started, as most epic tales of suburban warfare do, with a parking space. Or rather, the lack of a parking space. Specifically, my parking space, which was currently occupied by Karen's behemoth of a luxury SUV, parked not just near my driveway, but directly, aggressively across it. And there she stood, arms crossed, a smirk playing on her lips, ready to unleash the first salvo in what would become known as the Great Driveway Debacle. The glint in her eyes gave only small detail of what has to come. The smirk on Karen's face was practically glowing. It was the kind of smirk that said, "I've got you now." And honestly, for a moment I thought she might. "Morning, Karen," I said, trying to inject a note of casual friendliness into my voice, a feat about as easy as juggling chainsaws while riding a unicycle. "Is there a reason your car appears to be auditioning for the role of immovable object in my driveway?" She tilted her head, the helmet hair remaining perfectly undisturbed. "Oh, I know exactly where my car is, Jake," she purred, her voice dripping with a sweetness that could curdle milk. "It's on HOA business." "HOA business?" I blinked. "What kind of HOA business requires blocking someone's driveway?" "We've had complaints," she said, waving a hand dismissively, a gesture that somehow managed to be both vague and infuriating. "About your driveway." I looked at my driveway. It was a driveway, concrete, rectangular, utterly unremarkable. "Complaints? From whom? About what?" "That's confidential," she said, tapping a perfectly manicured fingernail against a clipboard that seemed to materialize out of thin air. "But the HOA board has determined that your driveway is non-compliant." "Non-compliant?" I sputtered, feeling my blood pressure rising. "Non-compliant with what? The law of gravity? The existence of concrete?" Karen's smile widened, revealing a set of teeth that could probably cut diamonds. Unfortunately, the HOA has the final say, and until we conduct a proper review, I'll need to keep my vehicle here to prevent further infractions. I stared at her, speechless for a moment, the absurdity of the situation threatening to overwhelm me. "You're joking, right? This is a joke. You're going to move your car, and we're all going to laugh about this later." "Nope," she chirped, scribbling something on her clipboard with a flourish. "Oh, and I should mention, any attempt to tow my vehicle will be considered harassment, per HOA regulations, Section 42, subsection B, paragraph, well, you get the idea." She favored me with one last triumphant smile. I wanted to yell, to argue, to physically lift her SUV and hurl it into the nearest lake. But I knew Karen. She thrived on confrontation. She wanted me to lose my temper, to give her an excuse to bury me under a mountain of fines and legal threats. So, I did the only thing I could do. I took a deep breath, nodded slowly, and walked back inside, my mind already racing. The next few days were a special kind of hell. Karen's SUV remained stubbornly, defiantly in place. My calls to the HOA were met with polite but firm stonewalling. A tow truck company I contacted politely declined, citing some vague community agreement. Meanwhile, Karen strutted around like she'd just won the lottery and conquered a small nation. Then came the fines. Apparently, failure to utilize driveway was now a punishable offense. Every day, a new, creatively worded violation notice arrived in my mailbox, each one demanding payment for increasingly ridiculous infractions. Unauthorized accumulation of driveway dust. Improper reflection of sunlight off driveway surface. It was infuriating, maddening, and utterly, completely insane. But I wasn't about to give up. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I'd play strategically. I'd play by the rules, and then I'd find a way to rewrite them. This was no longer just about a driveway. This was war, and I was about to build myself a fortress. The seed of a ridiculously audacious plan started forming to take root, grow, and to fight back. The fines were piling up faster than dirty laundry in a college dorm room. Each new notice was a fresh insult, a testament to Karen's petty tyranny. I knew I couldn't keep this up. I needed a solution, and it had to be something unconventional. Something that would not only solve the immediate problem, but also send a clear message. Don't mess with Jake. My evenings were no longer spent grilling steaks. They were spent hunched over my laptop, fueled by coffee and a burning desire for revenge. Legal revenge, of course. I dove into the murky depths of zoning laws, property codes, and HOA regulations. It was a tedious, mind-numbing process, filled with legal jargon and bureaucratic doublespeak. Most lawyers I spoke to, after the explanation of my plan, the answer was a hard no. I felt stuck. I was wading through endless pages of ordinances, feeling increasingly hopeless. One particularly dense paragraph about temporary structures and property line setbacks almost made me throw my laptop out the window. But then a glimmer of hope, a single, almost insignificant line buried deep within a subsection on security modifications. It stated, in surprisingly clear language, that there were no restrictions on implementing security measures on private property, as long as they weren't permanent fixed structures. It was like finding the cheat code to the whole game. A loophole big enough to drive a very large SUV through. I reread the line, then reread it again, just to be sure. I cross-referenced it with other sections, checked for any amendments or exceptions. Nothing. It was airtight. A slow grin spread across my face. The germ of an idea, planted during my earlier frustrated musings, began to sprout. A ridiculous, audacious, utterly brilliant idea. An idea that involved a trench, a very, very big trench, and maybe, just maybe, a drawbridge. It was crazy and my last solution. The next day, the quiet suburban street was shattered by the roar of a rented excavator. Not a dainty little garden tiller, mind you, but a full-sized, earth-munching beast of a machine. I'd also hired a crew of construction workers, guys who looked like they'd spent more time building highways than digging. Well, whatever this was going to be. "So, you want a trench?" The foreman, a burly man named Mike, asked, scratching his head. "Around your driveway?" "Not just any trench, Mike," I said, my grin probably bordering on manic. "A moat. A proper medieval-style moat. Deep, wide, and utterly impassable by any vehicle, particularly a certain oversized SUV." Mike and his crew exchanged glances. I could practically see the thought bubbles above their heads. This guy's nuts. But they shrugged. Money talks, and I was paying by the hour. The work began, and it was glorious. The excavator ripped into the earth, sending plumes of dirt and dust flying. The neighbors, initially drawn out by the noise, started to gather, their expressions a mixture of bewilderment and amusement. Mrs. Gable, our resident information broker, was practically vibrating with excitement, her phone already out and recording. Old Mr. Henderson, surprisingly spry for his age, was watching from his porch, a knowing twinkle in his eye. As the trench grew, so did the absurdity of the situation, and my own sense of mischievous glee. I'd even purchased a ridiculously cheap plastic knight's helmet online, which I wore with pride as I supervised the construction, occasionally shouting things like, "Make it deeper, wider, we must defend the realm." Of course, things weren't entirely smooth. We hit a snag, literally. The excavator's bucket snagged on a massive tree root, hidden beneath a layer of dirt, sending a jolt through the machine and stalling the engine. Mike and his crew spent a frustrating hour wrestling with the root, using chainsaws, pry bars, and a healthy dose of profanity. Then came the rain. Not a gentle drizzle, but a full-on torrential downpour that threatened to turn my newly dug trench into a muddy swimming pool. We scrambled to cover the exposed earth with tarps, working like madmen in the driving rain. I was soaked, covered in mud, and probably looked like a drowned rat, but I couldn't stop grinning. Karen, of course, had been conspicuously absent during the initial stages of the project. I suspected she was holed up in her house, plotting my demise with the HOA rulebook as her weapon of choice. But as the sun began to set on the second day, and the trench was nearing completion, a glorious, gaping chasm encircling my driveway, she finally emerged. Her reaction was priceless. Her perfectly composed facade cracked, replaced by an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. Her jaw dropped, her eyes widened, and for a moment she just stood there, speechless, staring at her stranded SUV, now perched precariously on a concrete island in the middle of a muddy abyss. "What in the hell is this?" she finally managed to screech, her voice reaching a pitch that could shatter glass. I strolled over, casually leaning against the excavator, my plastic knight's helmet slightly askew. "Oh, this?" I said, gesturing grandly at the trench. "Just some security modifications. HOA rules, you know. Gotta protect my property." Karen's eye twitched. You can't just dig a hole around my car." "Sure I can," I said, pulling out a printout of the zoning ordinance I'd so meticulously researched. "See? Perfectly legal. In fact, I even filed a permit, city approved." I offered the paper to her. This was the beginning of the war. Karen took the printed ordinance, her hand trembling slightly, whether from rage or disbelief I couldn't tell. She scanned it, her lips moving as she silently mouthed the words. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a particularly angry ghost. You're going to regret this, she spat, crumpling the paper in her fist. The HOA will not allow this. Guess we'll see, I shrugged, already turning away. I had bigger and considerably more ridiculous fish to fry. The trench was a good start, but it was merely the appetizer. The main course was yet to come, the drawbridge. If Karen thought a moat was outrageous, she was in for a rude awakening. I'd spent the previous evening sketching out designs, inspired by a documentary I'd watched on medieval castles. Research, you see, is key. The best part? I didn't need anything fancy, just reinforced wood, strong metal hinges, and a robust pulley system. It didn't have to be actually medieval grade. It just had to look the part. The next morning, I assembled my materials, along with a few skilled carpenters I'd hired, making sure at least one of them has experience with this kind of work. Mr. Henderson, surprisingly, offered his assistance. "Used to build bridges back in my day," he said with a wink, his eyes gleaming with an almost unsettling enthusiasm. "Not quite like this, but principles are the same." The construction process was a spectacle in itself. I, of course, continued to wear my plastic knight's helmet, occasionally offering expert advice like, "More bracing. We must withstand a siege." The neighbors gathered again, this time with lawn chairs and snacks, treating it like a neighborhood block party. Mrs. Gable was live-streaming the whole thing, providing colorful commentary to her growing online audience. Karen, meanwhile, was escalating her attacks. She called in city inspectors who arrived expecting to find a blatant violation of every building code in existence. Instead, they found a perfectly legal, albeit highly unusual, security feature. They left shaking their heads, a mixture of amusement and resignation on their faces. She tried to organize a petition, circulating a document filled with inflammatory language about unsightly structures and property value depreciation. But most of the neighbors, tired of her constant meddling, refused to sign. Some even added their names to a counter-petition I'd started, titled, "We Love the Moat." She even attempted to block my contractors from entering the neighborhood, claiming they were unauthorized personnel. That backfired spectacularly when one of the carpenters turned out to be the brother of a city councilman. The councilman, upon hearing the story, apparently found the whole situation so hilarious that he personally intervened, ensuring my crew had unrestricted access. By the time the drawbridge was fully installed, it was a thing of beauty. A sturdy wooden platform, perfectly sized to span the trench, controlled by a simple but effective pulley system. I gave it a test run, pulling the rope and watching with immense satisfaction as the bridge lifted, leaving my driveway completely inaccessible. Karen, who had been lurking nearby, let out a strangled noise that sounded like a cross between a growl and a whimper. "This is insane," she screamed. "You can't have a medieval fortress in the middle of a suburban neighborhood." "It's not a fortress," I said, my voice dripping with mock innocence. "It's a security feature, for protecting my property. HOA rules encourage security improvements, don't they?" I gave the best smile to her. I thought the drawbridge would be the end of it. A clear victory, a statement made. But Karen, it turned out, was not one to go down without a fight. A very, very messy fight. The silence that followed the drawbridge's completion was unsettling. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet hum before the engine of crazy roared to life. That night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. My heart leaped into my throat. I scrambled out of bed, adrenaline pumping, and peered through the blinds. At first, I saw nothing. The neighborhood was dark, silent, except for the crickets, who were, thankfully, chirping within acceptable HOA-approved decibel levels. Then I flipped on the outdoor lights. My stomach dropped. The drawbridge, my glorious, ridiculous drawbridge, was broken. It lay half-collapsed into the trench, the wooden planks splintered and cracked. The ropes, thick and strong just hours before, were severed, hanging limply. My hand went to my phone, my fingers already dialing 911. But then I paused. I had security cameras. I'd installed them when I started the whole trench project, partly for legal protection, partly because I had a feeling things might get interesting. I pulled up the footage on my phone, rewinding to the time of the crash. And there she was, Karen, dressed in all black, like some kind of low-budget ninja, complete with a pair of bolt cutters that were almost comically oversized. She'd actually climbed into the trench, a feat in itself considering the mud and the depth, and systematically sawed through the ropes. I watched, a mixture of fury and disbelief washing over me, as she surveyed her handiwork, a triumphant smirk on her face. Then she scrambled out of the trench and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't hesitate. I called the police, my voice shaking with a combination of anger and, I admit, a little bit of fear. "I'd like to report a trespassing and property damage," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "And I have video evidence." By the time the officers arrived, Karen had retreated to her house, probably thinking she'd gotten away with it. But the footage was irrefutable. They knocked on her door. There was a tense few minutes of muffled shouting, and then the door swung open. Karen, still in her black ninja outfit, was dragged outside, protesting loudly about being harassed and targeted. She tried to spin the story, claiming she was preventing a neighborhood hazard, but the officers weren't buying it. They placed her under arrest, her wrists cuffed behind her back. The look she gave was pure hatred. The neighborhood exploded with gossip the next day. It turned out Karen had been a simmering volcano of resentment for years, and her arrest was the eruption everyone had been secretly waiting for. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact were now openly sharing stories of Karen's past transgressions. The time she'd tried to ban bird feeders, the incident with the incorrectly colored mailbox, the legendary Great Garden Gnome Massacre of '09. The HOA board, realizing they were on the losing side of a very public battle, called an emergency meeting. They knew they had to act decisively, or they'd be swept away in the tide of anti-Karen sentiment. Mrs. Gable naturally was there, live blogging the entire event. Mr. Henderson, surprisingly, also attended, sitting quietly in the back row, a faint smile playing on his lips. I arrived at the meeting armed with more than just righteous indignation. I had the video evidence, of course, but I also had something else. A meticulously compiled folder of Karen's financial misdeeds. Turns out she wasn't nearly as careful with HOA funds as she was with enforcing her petty rules. I'd uncovered a pattern of fraudulent fines, misused funds, and even a suspicious offshore account. Karen, looking pale and defeated, tried to defend herself. She claimed I was lying, that the video was fabricated, that the financial records were misinterpreted, but her protests were weak and unconvincing. "I have proof," I stated, placing the folder on the table with a resounding thud. "And I'm willing to take this to the authorities." Silence. Then, one by one, the other board members who had previously cowered under Karen's rule started to speak up. They'd seen the video. They'd heard the stories. They'd seen the financial records. Within minutes, Karen was voted out as HOA president, her reign of terror officially over. An investigation into her shady dealings began, unanimously, by the end of the week. The empire had fallen. With Karen gone, the HOA crumbled like a poorly constructed sandcastle. Most of the remaining members resigned, and the neighborhood voted, overwhelmingly, to dissolve the association entirely. Turns out, people were happier without it. As for me, I became a local legend. The story of the trench and drawbridge spread far beyond our little street. I even installed a small plaque at the edge of the trench, in memory of HOA tyranny. It made for a great conversation starter. One evening, as the sun set, I found myself, back at peace, and maybe thinking on what his next project might be,